Welcome and thank you for coming. My name is Patty Katz, President of Reach Out America. To review a few important events since our last meeting. Last week, we sponsored a Zoom forum for the candidates running for yesterday's school board election. It was attended by more than 115 people. It was extremely informative. Both Grant Tock and Barbara Berkowitz won the seats that were available. But back to Washington, or we're going to Washington here, Republican state legislators have written at least 404 voting restriction bills that have now been introduced in 48 states. This will have a disproportionate impact on voters of color. 179 of those bills are already dead, but there are 137 still in process, and there are 25 that have already been put into law. We have immediately breaking news. What's happening today, it just happened behind closed doors. Republicans voted out Wyoming Representative Liz Cheney from her leadership position in the House as GOP conference chair. To one of my points, she was one of the few Republicans that had some sense. It's because that she voted to impeach Trump that this came up. And House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy from California has not only signaled his plan to do that, he voted to also support New York Representative Elise Stefanik to replace her. We have some good news that yesterday a federal bankruptcy judge dismissed an effort for the NRA to file bankruptcy, ruling it was not done in good faith. So what happens is this will return it back to New York State Attorney General Letitia James, who is seeking to shut down the organization over alleged fraud and abuse. We hope that this is something that she can actually accomplish. That would be phenomenal. The first major offshore 2.8 billion wind project known as Vineyard Wind 1 off Martha's Vineyard was approved by the Biden administration. It will consist of 62 turbines spaced out about a mile apart, each standing about 837 feet above the water's surface. The project is expected to produce enough renewable energy, electricity to power 400,000 Massachusetts homes every year, while also saving ratepayers billions of dollars and reducing annual carbon dioxide emissions in the state by about 1.68 million metric tons. So that's really great news. We're very excited to have an additional webinar this month that will take place Wednesday night, May 26th at 7:30 p.m. with special guest speaker, Congresswoman Grace Ming. Please join us there and please save the date. We're going to be sending out announcements soon, a save the date announcement for June 27th, as we'll be having our first live fundraiser at the Inn at Great Neck with special guest speaker, Attorney General Letitia James. We are all really excited about this. And due to COVID restrictions, seating is very limited, extremely limited. So when you receive the date flyer, please send in your check for $100 immediately to reserve your seat. So thank you very much. So our speaker, we're very excited about. So she brings a lot to the table. It's a very timely issue. So I'd like to now turn the virtual floor over to Harriet Becker to introduce her. Thank you.
Before I introduce my friend Helen Turner, you know I am Harriet Becker, and you also know that I am the fundraiser for Reach Out America. So again, I would like to remind you to please send in your $45 membership for a whole year, or we can take donations or send in your $100. All you have to do is go on reachout-america.com and click on the green button. It's on every page, and there's no reason that you cannot do that. So this month's webinar is of the utmost importance, as you know. It couldn't have come at a more auspicious time. I've known Helen Turner since she started at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center. If you read ROA's ad in the Great Neck News, you saw how qualified she is in running the center's education program. Helen is tasked with educating hundreds, if not thousands, of police, teachers, and students about the lessons of the Holocaust. These lessons also relate to the bigotry and hate that is going on in all of lives today in this country. Please pay close attention to what Helen tells you today. She is a great authority on these subjects. Here is Helen Turner.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. It is my honor and my privilege to be here with you this afternoon. A special thank you to Patricia Katz for inviting me, and of course to Harriet Becker, who I have had the pleasure of knowing for a number of years. Thank you so much for having me come and speak to your organization. So we are talking about a difficult and extraordinarily timely subject this afternoon. I'm going to be using a PowerPoint just to give us some visuals. I'm probably going to be speaking for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then I'm going to open up the floor for some Q&A. I do have some questions that were submitted to me previously, so I've already crafted some answers, and I think some of them will be answered in our presentation. But if I may, I'm going to share my screen. So here we go. So today's discussion is looking at extremism. I'm going to really ground us in Nazism, obviously looking at lessons of the Holocaust, and bringing us forward into now and extremist movements that we're seeing taking place today. This is a very difficult topic to talk about. I think it can really raise a lot of questions. I think it raises a lot of anxieties and concerns. And so as we go forward, I encourage you to join me in a brave space to have this discussion. A brave space means that we're going to lean into vulnerability and understanding, that we're going to try and hear these difficult truths or difficult things that we are confronting. We're going to be vulnerable with our own experience. If folks are going to be commenting in the chat, I know we're going to be talking about things that hit probably pretty close to home. We're also going to operate from a place of good intent. I know that everybody that is logged on today, you know, on this gorgeous sunny day, you're watching this webinar. I know that you're coming with your best foot forward to engage in the best conversation that we can have. And the third, unfortunately, is to accept and expect non-closure. This topic is vast. In the time that I'm going to be talking to you, I'm going to hit just the tip of the iceberg. And so in this regard, preemptively, I beg for your patience and for your understanding that we cannot cover all things in one session. But I do hope that this maybe sparks your interest and leads you to different avenues of investigation on this topic. So first, we need to understand exactly what we're talking about. We need some parameters. So what is extremism? I think nowadays extremism can really be bantered around a lot. You know, oh, that's extremist or this is extremism. But there's actually a very clear definition for it. And this comes from the Anti-Defamation League. So extremism is defined as a religious, social, or political belief system that exists substantially outside of belief systems more broadly accepted in society. So something that is extreme, outside of the mainstream. Now, usually when we think extremism, we might cognitively go to negative extremism. I think we usually take it to far right-wing, white supremacist extremism. That's where I'm going to take it today. But we know that extremism itself is not necessarily bad. If we look at the abolitionist movement, the pre-Civil War one, we're really looking at an example of an extreme movement that had admirable goals, equality of human beings. But it existed at that moment in time outside of the mainstream. And so the views or the tactics to engage in this movement were sometimes seen as objectionable. However, I want to root our conversation today in negative extremist movements, those that dehumanize our fellow human beings, because we're going to begin in the context of Nazism and bring it forward to white supremacy and anti-Semitism. So first of all, we need to ask ourselves the basic question: how do we get to extremism? None of us are born particularly extreme, really. We have different thoughts and different feelings, but how do we get to this moment of extremism? I always ground my conversations with students, adults, police, with the pyramid of hate. This is how we get there. So a few things about the Pyramid of Hate. It was created by the Anti-Defamation League and is really used as a Holocaust educational tool, but can be used for a lot of different genocides and moments of extremism. So when we're talking about the Pyramid of Hate, a few things to keep in mind. The first is it's not a one-way street. Different societies, different moments in history, sometimes go a little bit up the pyramid, come back down, go back up again. So it's a flexible pyramid. Also, it's a reversible one. And this is key for our conversation. We're going to look at a society that took it all the way to the top, and then we're going to question our own society as we look to reverse. But we must begin at the bottom of the pyramid. And this is rooted in bias. Bias, my friends, is something that we all have. We have bias because we are raised by human beings who are flawed individuals. And we are raised in a society that has books and movies and music and all kinds of societal norms that tell us who to be and how to be. And this is sometimes going to promote the bias of our own group, right? I like people who look and act and think like me, and a rejection or a separation of people who are not looking and acting and thinking like me. This is a normal human function. And we might even work really, really hard to work against our bias. To say, no, I like everybody, I'm pro everyone, everybody is equal and the same. Well, that's lovely. But sometimes we have an implicit bias. We don't even realize it's there. And that's because bias is taught to us on such a deep and profound level. And sometimes I think the greatest work that we can do is to confront our own bias and to work on it deeply and engage with it daily. But bias is really the lowest of the low levels. We all have it, we're all working on it to some degree. If it goes unchallenged and unchecked for a period of time, we could lead to individual acts of bias. We're going to be looking at some of those acts in the presentation, acts that have hit very close to home, such as hate symbols or cyber attacks. But we know that individual acts of bias are almost like a warning signal to a society, that people's internal beliefs are coming to the external. If these things go unchallenged and unchecked for a period of time, they could lead to systematic discrimination. This could be housing discrimination, employment discrimination, educational discrimination, medical discrimination. If this goes unchallenged and unchecked for a period of time, it can lead to bias-motivated violence, the physical attacking of a group based on who we perceive them to be. And of course, as we know from history, if this goes unchallenged and unchecked for a significant period of time, we could lead to genocide. To be clear, the definition of genocide is the intent to destroy, in part or in whole, a racial, religious, or ethnic group of people. We're going to be looking at the Holocaust today. The Holocaust is one of many genocides, and all genocides have that theme of the intent to destroy, in part or in whole, a racial, religious, or ethnic group of human beings. This is the worst of what we can do to one another, a crime against humanity. It is extreme. But genocide does not begin overnight. Genocide needs the base layer to feed it, as does extremism. So let's go back to our discussion on extremism. We talked about kind of what it is. Now let's talk about what draws people to it. Why are people drawn to extremist movements and extremist communities? I recently heard a fantastic lecture by Dr. Ari Kunglansky. He is a Holocaust survivor and a professor of psychology at the University of Maryland. And he broke down extremism in such a manageable way for me that I could really make these connections between Nazism and what we're seeing today. So why do people join extremist movements? They really need the three N's to exist. The first is a need. The person joining or the persons joining are on a quest for significance, which can be found through an enemy. So this means that someone feels silenced, or they feel forgotten or left behind or disregarded for whatever reason. Now, this could be something they've completely created in the narrative of their mind, or it could be something that they really feel. They feel left behind. They feel not involved for a plethora of reasons. Once we've got that need, we need a narrative. Why did this happen to you? Why have you been left behind? And whose fault is it? And here we find our common enemy that must be defeated. And of course, these two things cannot exist in a silo by themselves. They would simply make a vortex of one's own thoughts. The core here is a network, people who support this narrative. You need something to show you that you are not alone. So if we are going to continue throughout the presentation with the three N's, the need, the narrative, and the network. These things will fuel extremist movements, both in the past and in the present. So let's jump forward first into our German context as we root ourselves in the Holocaust, my wheelhouse, before we can bring us to the future. So we need to understand the creation of the need. Who was feeling left behind in Germany before Adolf Hitler came to power? And here, let's root ourselves in the context of World War I, called the war to end all wars. It was absolutely devastating. I happen to be from England. I grew up there. I lived there from the ages of birth to 10. And the narrative and the loss experienced in World War I, and of course later in World War II, is embedded in the fabric of society. And I think that's something really key to keep in mind, especially those of us with an American perspective who might have a different feeling of the gravity of this war. To break it down in some numbers, we know that during World War I, Germany lost 2 million young men. 4.2 million had been wounded. This could mean the loss of an arm, loss of eyesight, loss of legs. 19% of the male population were casualties of the war. And of course, our civilian population, those left at home on the home front, suffered from extreme malnutrition. Starvation was serious and fatal. Not to mention living through bombings, living through air raids, living through the absolute terror of being in a world at war. Now, to further explain the German context, I'm actually going to show us a short clip, about 3 minutes or so, of a video called The Path to Nazi Genocide. When we talk about the collapse of Germany, and it was a true collapse in the aftermath of World War I, this gives us a better sense of the need, of the vacuum. So let me show you this short clip.
The humiliation of Germany's defeat and the peace settlement that followed in 1919 would play an important role in the rise of Nazism and the coming of a Second World War just 20 years later. What shocked so many in Germany about the treaty signed near Paris at the Palace of Versailles was that the victors dictated a future in which Germany was deprived of any significant military power. Germany's territory was reduced by 13%. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for starting the war and to pay heavy reparations. To many, including 30-year-old former Army Corporal Adolf Hitler, it seemed the country had been stabbed in the back, betrayed by subversives at home and by the government who accepted the armistice. In fact, the German military had quietly sought an end to the war it could no longer win in 1918. It cannot be that 2 million Germans should have fallen in vain, Adolf Hitler later wrote. We demand vengeance. Many veterans and other citizens struggled to understand Germany's defeat and the uncertain future. Troops left the bloody battlefields and returned to a bewildering society. A new and unfamiliar democratic form of government, the Weimar Republic, replaced the authoritarian empire and immediately faced daunting challenges. Thousands of Germans waited in lines for work and food in the early 1920s. Middle-class savings were wiped out as severe inflation left the currency worthless. Some burned it for fuel. Economic conditions stabilized for a few years. Then the worldwide depression hit in 1929. The German banking system collapsed, and by 1930, unemployment skyrocketed to 22%. In a country plagued by joblessness, embittered by loss of territory, and demoralized by ineffective government, political demonstrations frequently turned violent. Many political parties had their own paramilitary units to attack opponents and intimidate voters. In 1932, 99 people were killed in the streets in 1 month.
So it's into this world of chaos and turmoil that we see the rise of Adolf Hitler. So I show us this video because I think it does a great job of really quickly sort of summarizing the chaos that was taking place in Weimar Germany. They had lost the war, they had lost territory, they were blamed for the war, they had to pay tremendous reparations or money to the winning countries. And we can see the vast economic instability that takes place. What I also want to highlight is that there were significant changes in societal norms. Women begin working outside of the home. People are expressing their sexuality and their gender in more fluid and more expressive ways that are way more public than they have been previously. And the world is changing in 1918. But for many, this feels like a lot of change: social disruption, economic disruption, political disruption. And it's into this vacuum that we get Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler is invited into the German government in January of 1933 as part of a coalition. This is a propaganda piece that was taken. This photograph, actually, this particular scene, was reenacted many, many times for the press. It's supposed to do a very specific thing. Adolf Hitler, as we may know from our history, was seen as an extremist, a radical. He was actually arrested during the Munich beer hall push, which was an attempt to overthrow the Weimar Republic, and he was put into prison. However, his trial made him very famous. And it is during his imprisonment that he writes his book, Mein Kampf, which really lays out his plan of what he's going to do when he comes into power, and specifically how he will deal with Jewish people. So this photograph, after Hitler has been welcomed into the government, is supposed to reassure me, the reader, that Adolf Hitler is now under control. We can see from his body language that he is actually, literally bowing down to President von Hindenburg. We also see some interesting things in what they're wearing. Hitler is dressed in a business suit, not a military suit. This is a departure from the old guard, but it's also supposed to show that he is concerned with the economy. He's a politician, not a military man. And in contrast, we see President von Hindenburg with all of his military regalia, his hat, standing imposingly, even with the traditional mustache, to sort of keep Hitler in check. However, we know from our history, this will be very short-lived. After the burning of the Reichstag fire in February of 1933, so 1 month after Hitler's invited into the German government, the enabling laws are signed, which effectively make Hitler the dictator of Germany. And after von Hindenburg's death in 1934, Hitler makes a deal with the German military and becomes the Führer of Nazi Germany. It is here that I would like us to revisit our discussion on need. So we saw from the video that we have a lot of young men, veterans, who are out of work, unemployed, feeling very disillusioned about the end of the war. They're suffering bodily injuries along with shell shock. And you have a civilian population that also is now grappling with ongoing starvation. People are burning money. It truly feels like chaos. So we have a need. People in German society feel silenced, left behind, and betrayed by their government. This creates the ability for a tremendous amount of conspiracy theories, particularly surrounding common enemies. Now, if we look back again to our history and we take a little departure from Germany for a minute and we look at the history of Europe, we know that we have a long-standing history of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is the specific prejudice and hatred of Jewish people. In our museum at the Holocaust Center, we date it back to 1096 with the Crusades. And I tell you that really to talk about the long history of this hatred. Hitler created very little that was new or nuanced about this particular hatred. If we look at these posters, one is from the Nazi era, that is the So oder So, but I would like us to begin with Le Peril Juif. This is a very famous propaganda piece from something called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This is a conspiracy theory that Jewish people are taking over the world. This particular piece, which is found also in our museum, is dated from 1903, and it speaks to this long history of anti-Semitism. In the propaganda piece, it reads in French, Le Peril Juif, up top. On the bottom tells me the name of the pamphlet, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. But what I can see is a characteristically Jewish man. I know this from the stereotypes being expressed, big nose, dark eyebrows, dark hair, gripping the world. And we can see his hands are on Europe and North America. And from them, blood drips. Underneath, I know it's hard to see in the small cartoon, but it's bodies. And the Peril Juif, of course, means the Jewish danger. So here we've got this historical enemy, an existential threat. The Jewish people are not only taking my jobs or hoarding all the money in Germany, they are taking over the world. We are an existential threat. And then if I see the other poster, I'm seeing this one or that one, the So oder So. And I'm really looking at the negative Jewish stereotype again. The person on the right-hand side, he's linked with communism, a political threat, Judaism, this existential threat, and of course he looks menacing versus my Aryan German. So there is suddenly created a need, right? I've got a disenfranchised and angry population who's feeling hungry, unemployed, ticked off, concerned about where the world is going. And I've got two major threats: Jewish people, a historic threat, and communism, a new threat. So if I've got that, I now need a narrative to support it. The Nazis were incredible propaganda machinists, but they really linked into what all human beings want, which is community. In the Nazi ideology, this is called the Volkska Mineshaft, the people's community. And sometimes I think if I sort of mention it casually, like, oh, there was this idea of the Volkska Mineshaft, it can seem minor. I want to emphasize here that it became a core of identity. If you feel that you have no job, no money, your husband is injured and hurt, your kids don't have a good school to go to, but you're part of a people's community and we come together, we are united, it creates a deep sense of belonging, a deep sense of self-worth. In this propaganda piece, I've got a poster from 1938, and it's talking about Greater Germany, it's talking about a vote. But the thing I want to emphasize, it says, Großdeutschland, Greater Germany, and all these Heils going up in unison. We are in it together. Also, when we think of the Volkska Mineshaft, we know that it's holding up the Aryan Germans, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, white Germans as the superior race. And the big part of the Volkska Mineshaft is who's in and who's out. Our enemies, the Jewish people, people with disabilities, Afro-Germans, Roma and Sinti, also known as Gypsies, communists, Jehovah's Witnesses, all these people are out. But in the Volkska Mineshaft, the Aryans are securely in. And also to go back to this idea of community efforts, the Nazis were very smart in creating things like the Winter Relief Fund. These are grassroots movements that provided food and clothing for people in the community. So again, creating this sense that not only do you belong, but you are valued and we need you. This gave a clear sense of belonging, clear societal roles, and they were very often based on gender. So as we talked about during the Weimar Republic, we have this fluctuation of sexual norms, of societal norms, women working outside of the home. A big part of the Volkska Mineshaft was to come back to our roots, who we really were, the nuclear family, mom at home, beautiful baby, dad in the fields. So this is the cover of a Nazi publication on race. And we can see that motherhood is being celebrated here. The Aryan mother and her child are the future of Germany. They must be protected, again, from this existential threat. Who is doing the protecting? The men are doing the protecting. This is for German students, but I think it gives us that strapping, German man. He's holding his flag with pride. He's muscular, he's strong, and he's fighting for the Führer and the people. So we see the emergence of extremely clear gendered roles. So here's our need, here's our narrative. Let's focus on our network. So we know that during the Nazi period, Adolf Hitler is going to become the dictator of Germany, making that network a very closed one. Nazism becomes the only political party. But also, because this ideology is so deeply rooted in this idea of the Volkska Mineshaft, there are rallies, there are parades, there is the Hitler Youth. There is such a network which communicates this idea of belonging. It really does take on a cult-like feel. Even the Heil Hitler salute becomes a very cult-like feel. We also cannot disregard the power of the radio. All of the great leaders of this time, sorry, I shouldn't say great, all of the major leaders of this time, if we look at Winston Churchill, FDR, and Hitler are all using the radio to communicate. They're suddenly in your living room talking to you. With Winston Churchill and FDR, this became sort of the fireside chats that we were quite familiar with as part of our own American understanding of a president listening and seeing us. It was true for Germans as well. They were listening to Hitler and other Nazi speakers on their radios and feeling very connected to this movement. Now, we of course know that there was a deep, dark, genocidal part to this movement, the attempted complete annihilation of all the Jewish people residing in Europe. We know that this led us to have extremism realized. This is a map that gives but a snapshot of the network of concentration, labor, transit, slave, and death camps that were created in the Nazi territory. Scholars have recently revealed that there are over 44,000 estimated camps where people were imprisoned. Now, I do have one graphic image in my presentation, though I do think the whole topic is upsetting. But I am going to show you an image of extremism realized because I want to talk about the people in the photograph. This is a pretty famous photograph of a mass killing in the Ukraine. This is taken of the Einsatzgruppen and was taken in sort of the apex of the killing of human beings outside of the camps. So this is the photograph of a mass shooting. I know it's very hard to look at. What I want us to look at in this photograph and to question is the man with the gun. Now, we know when we talk about the Einsatzgruppen, we're talking about 4 mobile killing units that were sent into the East after Operation Barbarossa, which was the invasion of the Soviet Union by Germany. It's during these killing operations that over 1.5 million people were killed with guns, usually in walking distance from their homes, outside of the ghettos, outside of the camps. And here we have a photograph that's very difficult to look at. It's also housed in our museum, of a woman holding her child as she's about to be shot. I want to pay respect to that woman, that her final moments were caught this way, that she is etched forever in our minds as this version of herself, not the loving mother, not the exploratory daughter, not the artist, the creator, the singer, the cook. She is seen in this moment as someone who is about to be killed simply for being who she is. Because the man with the gun has in some way, shape, or form bought into this narrative that she is an existential threat. She is an enemy to the German people, a direct threat to him and what he holds dear. And the only way for him to protect what he loves and cherishes is to kill her. This is the result of extremism. When a need, a narrative, and a network are met at such heightened levels, we forget our fellow human beings. We dehumanize to such a point that we are able to kill one another. Now, I always think it's so important to make sure that we center the voices of the victims whenever I give a talk or a presentation. And so here I'd like to introduce you to my dear friend Werner Reich, who's going to talk to us about his experience in the concentration camps, specifically Auschwitz-Birkenau.
And the first thing they said to us is, did you sign a piece of paper that you're going to be here for 6 months? And we said, yes, we did sign something. So I said, well, in 6 months you'll go through the chimney. And we said, what does it mean? So they pointed over there. See that chimney over there? And there were 4 of them. You'll be going through the chimney. And we thought it was a very stupid, very infantile type of a joke. And it took me roughly 3 weeks before I realized that this was reality.
So I center Werner's voice here because he's talking about the other part of extremism, not necessarily the shooting that is happening by the Einsatzgruppen, but the literal creation of death camps for the explicit murder of human beings. Werner's referring there to the crematoria and gas chamber that was in Auschwitz-Birkenau. He was a teenager, about 15, when he entered that space. And as you can hear from his voice, he simply could not believe that human beings would do this to one another. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, the world could not believe that human beings would do this to one another. I find this to be an interesting sign. It was posted just about a month after the liberation of Bergen-Belsen by the British. It reads, 10,000 unburied dead were found here. Another 13,000 have since died. All of them victims of the German New Order in Europe, an example of Nazi culture. This sign is supposed to represent a fraction of the loss that was experienced during the Holocaust. We know that 6 million men, women, and children were murdered for being Jewish during this time period because of an extremist idea that they were a physical and existential threat to other human beings. I find this sign interesting because it serves as sort of memorial, satire, and warning. And it begins to be part of the narrative we have of never again. We have Holocaust museums. I'm lucky enough to work in one. We have memorials. We have days of remembrance. We have the promise of never again. And yet when we think about talking about the Holocaust, we know that there is much work to be done. Nazi ideology continues. It has morphed into neo-Nazism, and we are seeing it on the rise in our own country. This is a photograph I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's from Charlottesville, Virginia, August of 2017. This photograph was taken during a Unite the Right rally. What I find interesting about this photograph is that we have a foreign symbol. The Nazi symbol was obviously part of Nazi Germany, a country that the United States defeated in World War II, is now on display with an American symbol, the Confederate flag, a symbol of slavery and the Civil War, which destroyed so many American lives. These symbols are now put together in Virginia, the birthplace of the United States, to protest the taking down of a statue of a Confederate general. So we have so much coming together on the ground. So many symbols, ideologies, and of course, extremism coming together. And we'll return to Charlottesville in a moment. But Charlottesville is just one example of something called HEAT. HEAT stands for hate, extremism, anti-Semitism, and terrorism. This is a heat map that's produced by the Anti-Defamation League. If you Google HEAT ADL, this map will come up. It's a live interactive map for you. There's many different versions of it, depending on the year you put in or the input you're looking for. This was a screenshot I took of the map today. So this is showing that in 2020 and 2021, there were 7,528 incidents of extremism and anti-Semitism in the United States. I will point out that the numbers did go down a little in 2020 because of the global pandemic. People were home. But now that we are out of the pandemic, or easing out of the pandemic, numbers are once again on the rise. These dots and circles can be linked to extremist murders, terrorist plots, extremist or police shootouts, white supremacist events, white supremacist propaganda, and anti-Semitic incidents. And I would draw your attention to New York. We have a large
Hi,
circle.
Helen, if you can hear me, you froze completely.
No, no, she's not.
Oh,
Not
okay.
at all. Not at all.
Okay, it was over here then. Thank
Oh
you.
dear.
Sorry.
All right.
Helen, you're fine. You're fine.
Okay. So I would draw your attention to New York, where we see a large white disc. Now this is encompassed by many, many, many circles. Now, grain of salt when looking at New York, we are a large city, lots of folks. Obviously, more things happen than, let's say, in North Dakota. This is okay and fair. But we are seeing a rise of extremism and anti-Semitism right where we live. Now, this rise has been going on for a while. Here are some statistics of domestic terror incidents broken down by year from the Washington Post. So we see domestic terrorism incidents have soared to new heights in the United States, driven chiefly by white supremacists, anti-Muslim and anti-government extremists on the far right. This is, of course, according to the Washington Post. But what I want to draw our attention to is the wave in the statistics. The Center for Strategic and International Studies began counting these statistics in 1994, hence our start point. And we can see 1994, we're kind of up here and we dip down a little bit into the 2000s. But right around the early 2000s into 2008, we begin to see some bumps as we get into more and more extremist events and different kinds of plots. And you can see to look at 2020 is shocking. So we know that the three N's have continued. Not only sort of talking about Nazi Germany, and Germany is a whole other discussion, but the three N's have continued in our own country. Perhaps the greatest lesson from the Holocaust is the treatment of human beings, but also why we get to extremism and how do we combat it. So if we take a look at white supremacy and American extremism for a minute or two, we want to once again refocus on the need, the narrative, and the network. So what's our need? Well, in the United States, particularly if we look sort of 2008, we've had really difficult economic situations, right? 2008 was devastating for so many folks. People were out of work, the housing market burst, things just didn't look the same anymore. Many middle-class Americans began to feel a lot of different pressures. We've seen a stagnation in wages, we've seen a stagnation in jobs, and also a changing in jobs, which has been hard for some folks to transition to more online work. We've also seen a decline in the coal industry and other industries that were very typical, good, steady sort of union-paying jobs. This has created a strain on parts of America, and particular people in America who are feeling left behind and ignored. We've also had a reckoning with our own racial past. With the election of President Obama, this created shockwaves in society, challenging societal norms. We've also had much more celebration and exposure to the LGBTQ community and folks who are living life in more non-traditional ways. So again, societal and economic flux is what I'm trying to get at here. So when we're talking about things like white supremacy, which will be my focus, we have to understand exactly what it is. White supremacy means that white people feel they have a dominance over people of other backgrounds. They feel that white people should live by themselves in a white-only society. They feel that white people have their own culture that is superior to all other cultures. This is a full-fledged ideology like Nazism. It is far more encompassing than simple racism or bigotry. It is it's a complete ideology of white supremacy to the exclusion of all else. And I think what's curious for us, and that I want us to bring out as we talk about the continuation of anti-Semitism, is that most white supremacists today further believe that the white race is in danger of extinction due to a rising flood of non-white people into the United States and around the world who are controlled and manipulated by Jewish people. Again, a Jewish conspiracy of world domination. And that there needs to be imminent action to save the white race. So once again, we have an extreme need. The need is the quest for significance found through a common enemy. Here are some propaganda pieces talking about two specific groups that were formulated in 2016. Vanguard America was formed in May of 2016 and focuses on white nationalism and uses the specific Nazi slogan of blood and soil. Identity Europa, founded in March of 2016, is dedicated to educating the public about the importance of a collective European identity, and it promotes European people. I want to draw your attention to the propaganda piece of the American Vanguard. Again, we have a snake, but linked to Judaism, obviously crushing the world again. And I see so many links to that earlier propaganda piece of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a Jewish world conspiracy. And so once again, we are seeing the rise of anti-Semitism. This narrative of a common enemy is being shown in the collection of supremacist and extremist movements coming together, such as white nationalists, neo-Nazis, and the alt-right in the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. So we're seeing extremist movements coming together over common enemies of foreigners, of Jewish people, of a threat. And now in our digital age, we have a tremendous network to support this narrative. Maybe back in the day, I could have been a lonely person alone in my home feeling these feelings. Now I simply need to log on and I can use hashtags like white genocide to find people who feel the way I do. I can communicate with hashtags, I can communicate in chat rooms, and this allows me to find an even bigger and broader network of extremists. Also, algorithms like on Facebook or YouTube help me find, if I search something, they will help continue my search, taking me further and further down the rabbit hole of whatever my extremist ideology is. And here I do want to make sure that we understand there are other extremist ideologies. I am focusing on white supremacy. Now, unfortunately, we also know that extremism is not an American problem. It is on the rise around the world. This is a United Nations report of the member states concerned by the growing and increasing transnational threat of extreme right-wing terrorism. So as you can see, we have a growing number of incidents, and I think to counter that also a growing number of arrests of people finding these extremist plots, finding extremist propaganda, and being able to try and shut it down. Now, thus far, we've talked about Charlottesville, which is obviously in a different state. We've talked about the United States, so sort of all encompassing. And now I've just thrown in worldwide extremism. But I do want us to kind of close by looking at our own local community. What's happening for us? We've seen extremism here online, such as the anti-Semitic attack on North Shore Hebrew Academy, which hacked into their server and was showing all kinds of horrific images and stole personal information of the people of that school. We've also seen a rise in swastikas taking place in our communities, such as Port Washington. This is from when the PAL was spray painted with swastikas, but I know recently schools have also been attacked. So we know that there is this rise of extremism. We know that it's happening not just in our own backyard, but around the world. So we have to leave this conversation with what we can do. And again, I want to root us in the 3 ends. We need to address these ends head on. We need to address the need. Whomever feels silenced or left out in our world, in our communities, need to be brought in. We need to acknowledge their feelings of silence. We need to acknowledge their feelings of marginalization and acknowledge and address that need. With our narrative, it is of the utmost importance that narratives of scapegoating and blame are dispelled immediately by the highest power of the land. We cannot have people being blamed for societal ills. We must attack it and dispel these narratives as individuals, as governments, as organizations, in any way that we can. And last but not least, we must disrupt extremist networks. This goes for us as individuals. Are we watching sort of what our children are looking at, our grandchildren, what we're diving into, right? Because we could be finding our own version of extremism. But it also is up to our governments and the people that keep us safe to disrupt these networks and scatter these thoughts. And last but not least, the best thing we can do is to stand up and speak out. If any community is under threat from a version of extremism that dehumanizes or devalues who they are, it is up to us to go to those rallies, to make sure that we speak out on Facebook, on Instagram, that we donate to organizations that advocate respect for every human being. And that is something that you and I can do each and every day. So I want to thank you so much. I'm going to stop my share. I know we had some prepared questions, but I also see there was some action in the chat. So I look to Harriet and Patricia, if you'd like me to go for the prepared questions or what direction you'd like me to take.
Well, first of all, I just want to thank you, Helen. That was really a remarkable presentation. Very, very powerful, very, it's hard to watch some of it, and I learned quite a bit, so thank you. If you'd like to just start with a prepared question, so I can tell people who are attending that if they do want to ask a question, to please go into the Q&A at the lower right side and write down a question. I know there's been a lot of comments. So I'll look through the comments and see what actual questions are there for you. So why don't you, I could start with a question that I think that one of, how we do it, just to let our attendees know, is that just to give people time to get their questions, we ask our executive board to write some questions so that we could get started. So I actually could start one from Harriet. I understand that there's been a lot of anti-Semitism at Great Neck South High School. And I think I heard that you actually have spoken there. So I was wondering, it's been going on for a long time. What can be done about that? How are you, presenting at the school? So I have a few questions about that, if you could get started while I look through this too. Thank you.
Certainly, yeah. So that was the first question I was going to address as well. I think particularly as pertains to sort of Great Neck in general, which I'm assuming maybe a lot of the people on the screen might be from Great Neck or live in Great Neck or know people in Great Neck, and particularly to South High School. We've been working with them for quite some time. I have presented to them on not only the Holocaust, but also specifically on symbols of hate, to specifically address swastikas, the noose, other hate language and symbols at the high school level. So we do engage with them actively. My only suggestion would be I would love to do more. I would love for the faculty, for more administrators, for more students to be engaged with the work that we do. Here at HMTC, we actually have a tiered pedagogical approach. I think to talk to a student about the Holocaust once in their academic career is simply not enough. It needs to be done repetitively at different age-appropriate levels. Here at HMTC, we really start our Holocaust education in the 5th grade. We have a 5th grade experience and then a different experience for each grade level all the way to seniors, which is really where you build on this idea that the Holocaust is not just history, facts and dates and things to memorize for the regents. It is a way of looking at the choices of human beings, and we need to look at our own choices to make change. And so that would really be my answer for Great Neck South, and I would love to engage with them more. We do work heavily with the district.
Keeping on that subject, Sandy asked, at Great Neck South with what's going on, how does it start and grow? And how can you control it? Is it smartphones? What's the platform? Is it internet? And if that's what's happening, is there a way that adults can,
Oh, certainly.
help stop the growth of the anti-Semitism?
I think so. From what I have heard, I've not have heard any specific incidents connected with that specific school this school year. In the past, I had heard that things were maybe drawn on a blackboard. I believe it was swastikas drawn on a blackboard. I think students have been texting things to one another. And this is typical of other schools that I've worked with on Long Island. I think number one, the message has to be very clear that this is a zero tolerance. If you draw it, if you say it, if you joke about it, this is a zero tolerance. There will be consequences. But I also think it really comes to education. Number one of my primary goals is obviously to educate on the history of the Holocaust for students to understand the gravity of what they are joking or talking or Snapchatting or texting about. But the second is also to educate them very practically on the criminal weight of what they're doing, that they will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. And I think in response, someone else had asked me about young offenders. I'm privileged to work with the district attorney's office for Nassau County with young offenders. So I meet a lot of the students who do this graffiti or send the text or send the Snapchat. And one of the biggest things that I aim to do, these are all minors, by the way. So they're all young people under the age of 18. And I think the big thing to do is to keep those three ends in mind. I do not want to create a need. I do not want to create a narrative. And I certainly don't want to create a network for that young person. If that young person is in pain, if that young person is angry, if that young person is feeling silenced, it is my job to call them in, to explain the gravity of what they have done, to hold them to the highest bar of the law that I can, but to also educate them on the weight of their words and their choices, and to help them make better choices.
Wonderful, thank you. Karen Rubin asks, so what happened when heretofore extremist movements become mainstream or official policy, which we're seeing that, we're absolutely seeing that.
I mean, I think it can be very dangerous. Look at Nazism. It was an extremist movement. Adolf Hitler was imprisoned for trying to overthrow the German government. And then he was welcomed in. And his government became the only government in Germany, and clearly led us to the Holocaust. I'm not saying that happens for every extremist movement. Obviously, that's an extremist movement. But I think we need to be very careful, I would say, with all extremist thought. I do feel that nowadays so many people can feel extreme on any side of an issue. We need to meet in the middle and remember that we're all human beings going through the difficult experience of life. And you might disagree with me, or I might disagree with you, but I need to put your humanity first. And I think as long as we keep respect for human beings at the core of what we do and who we are, that will help dissuade some of the more negative extremism.
Thank you. I have a question. When I was watching the presentation, the whole thing about Germany was that the area, that perfect Aryan. Well, Adolf Hitler had none of those qualities. How did he pull it off? Was it just all the propaganda and people just ignored the fact that he wasn't Aryan looking at all?
And he wasn't German.
Yeah.
He was not German, he's Austrian. I think it's a really good point, and students bring this up all the time because you'll show them all the posters and they're like, well, Hitler doesn't look like that. This is true. I think sometimes, and I would maybe get us to think about in our own lives, when we accept something, even if it's not logical, because it fits a narrative, right? This person, this man, Adolf Hitler, is telling me, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryan person, that I have been wronged, that I should have a job, that I should, especially as a woman, I should have a husband to provide for me, and I should make lots and lots of babies. And he's holding me up to this wonderful thing that my life could be. And so it's easy for me to ignore. He doesn't exactly look like the poster, or he's not, he's different. He doesn't quite fit the ideal, but he's telling me I'm ideal. And I think that goes for a lot of extremist leaders. We can sometimes not look at them because we are too busy looking at the narrative they present me, which fulfills some deep need in me. It's an excellent question.
Okay, thank you. Rita asked, do you think Trump ignited dormant flames of bigotry? If so, do you think the Biden administration has squashed those flames?
That is a tough question. So I should, I'm not really supposed to get political on this platform, but I think what we can look at is And obviously, I can't talk about political parties or anybody that I support as an individual, because I'm representing the Holocaust Center. But I think that when we look at the language used by whatever administration, is it a language of inclusion? Is it a language that puts human beings first? Is it a language that is kind? Versus, is it a language that creates outsiders? Is it a language that creates scapegoats? Is it a language of blame? And is it a language of dehumanization? And I think no matter which administration is in power, that would be my question. Because when we use dehumanizing language, we give voice and we give narrative to those who would dehumanize.
Great. Sticking with Rita, because she asked a question here, do you address terminology and issues of gender, sexuality, and acceptance in your work?
Depending on the program I do. So I think, as Harriet mentioned, I'm the director of education, and especially this year with our virtual programming, I've been really lucky to not only focus on the Holocaust, but also on a lot of contemporary issues. We have a special program called Courageous Conversations, which really addresses microaggressions, bias, and racism. And here we really do talk about a lot of the language of gender identity, sexual expression, and really just a language of acceptance. And that's really to help call people in. The most people I do that workshop for, Courageous Conversations, are for teachers who are struggling with how to speak with their students, for whom they sometimes feel removed from, or who they feel they want to make sure they get the language right, or who are grappling with it themselves. I think one of our biggest achievements in life can be how we address our own bias and how we think about our own language of acceptance and calling in instead of calling out.
Jeanette asks, how many Jewish children were saved either by being taken in by non-Jewish families, cared for in orphanages, or departed to other countries? And then what happened to those children after the war?
That is a fascinating question and a massive one.
Yeah, I don't know if she could answer that, but it's pretty remarkable.
I don't know the exact number, and I would say anyone would be pressed to find the exact number. People didn't exactly register after the Holocaust. Some people, number one, some people did not know that they were rescued. There's actually a growing movement in Poland at the moment, where people's parents are dying, they're passing away in their 90s, and they're being told that that the children are Jewish, that they rescued them, that they saved them. And so I believe there's a budding JCC, I want to say in Krakow, where they're actually helping people deal with this newfound Jewish identity and their lost family. So some people didn't know that they were rescued. Other people, of course, did not want to reveal. That became very scary. Some people are putting in the chat the Kindertransport. Kindertransport saved just shy of 10,000 children. Not all of them were Jewish, but the majority were. I want to say over 7,000 were Jewish children. And many of them had a variety of experiences in the UK. Some had very positive experiences. The families that took them in cared for them, loved them, protected them. Some had very abusive experiences and very difficult experiences. Some of them remained in the UK. There's a very large Kindertransport network there where I'm from. There's also a lot of Kindertransport survivors all over the world. We have a large community of Kindertransport survivors and their children connected with the Holocaust Center, and they're a core part of our Speakers Bureau. But I would say number of children rescued or saved it would be a very hard number to come up with. In the tens of thousands. But a hard number to come up with.
Okay, great. Thank you for that answer. Jeanette, this is probably going to be the last question. Did the Nazis have a system to accurately identify Jewish people? Like, what proof did individuals need to show whether they were Jewish or not?
That's a really, really good question. And unfortunately, one of the things that the Nazis actually grappled with was how to make this system. Because of course we know that Judaism is a religious experience. It is not something that could be measured in one's nose or sort of seen in a litmus test, right? So because it's an unreal category of a way to categorize a human being on something that you could test, very hard to actually create a system. So the Nazis began to identify Jewish people, they would simply look at synagogue lists, families registered at synagogues, and you've got the list. Also during this time, you have in some parts of Europe less assimilation. So people are sticking with, they're marrying Jewish families, so there's much more, families staying together, so you have common last names. This can also be an indicator. We also have people having to register their passports. So it becomes less about registering if you are Jewish, but more about you can't prove that you're not. And so Aryans are proving that they have family members who were christened and baptized. They got all these baptismal papers and tracing their lineage back 4 generations, and they can prove that they're Aryan. So if you can't prove that, you're something else. And here come in the Nuremberg laws, which give us the number of grandparents you have in order to be considered Jewish, or a Mischlinge, which is sort of like a half Jewish person. But this is also why, because this is so mercurial and very hard to pin down because it's not real, you get people trying to pass or pretend that they are not Jewish with false documents, to sneak out of the country. Girls dye their hair, do all different kinds of things to be unidentifiable. Excellent question.
Well, great. Thank you so much.
I have one
Yeah,
more question.
go ahead,
Just
Harriet.
one more question.
Sure.
That Patty did not see it, but I see it. So Nina Gordon asked this question, which I think is important. It says, there are extremists and religious sects of Judaism who are flaunting health protocols and hurling accusations of anti-Semitism at other Jews. How do we deal with these accusations of intra-Semitism?
I think that's a fantastic and very difficult question. I think in truth, extremism in all of its forms can be really dangerous because it's an extremist thought outside of the mainstream. But I think all we can do with any extremist thought, or and even accusations of, I like that terminology, Harriet, of intra-Semitism, is sort of what is it rooted in? Is it rooted in fear? Is it rooted in anger? Is it rooted in feeling outside? And how do we broach that conversation? What is leading extremist groups to not adhere to health protocols? How do we call them into that conversation about their health and safety and wellness? That is not blaming or shaming, but is bringing them into the conversation. And then also has to go on the other side. How can we meet in the middle to get what we both need? Because we know that sort of in the media, in people's minds, people always go to the most extreme version of something. And of course, if one section of Judaism is being more extreme and sort of coming to the fore in that kind of negative light, then it's going to have rippled effects on all people who are part of the Jewish faith. So I think it really is about coming together, calling people in, and trying to get to the root of what's really going on, and try and meet them in the middle.
Thank you very much. This has been very, very informative, and we really appreciate your time and your expertise on this subject, something that maybe we should look into again in the future, because there's so much going on all around the world, and locally there's so much happening. So thank you very much. And I just wanted to remind everyone again, don't forget to join us for our evening webinar with guest speaker Congresswoman Grace Meng to celebrate Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. And that will be May 26th. And that is an evening webinar at 7:30. And also please save the date for Sunday, June 27th, as we'll be having our first live fundraiser at the Inn at Great Neck with special guest speaker, Attorney General Letitia James, and seating is very limited. So thank you all. I hope you have a good month. Well, we'll see you in 2 weeks, hopefully. And thank you all, and have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Helen.
Thanks, Helen. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure and a privilege. And I really appreciate your time, and especially to Harriet for making this happen. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.